So, as I've said many times, part of my issue with the direction that the online right, the alt right, dissident right, far right, whatever you want to call it, has gone in the last few years is that I find they've just simply become cheerleaders for Trump, for the Republican Party, for not only that, but for just this conservative conception of the United States way too much. Like they've backtracked kind of from the third positionism, fascism, whatever you want to call it, that dominated it in the 2010s, and they've now become more like conservative Americanists, but a bit edgier. And part of the issue with that is I think there's this idealization of red states on the right where they act like red state America is this land of milk and honey where everything is amazing and it's just a paradise on earth and everything is good. And I mean, there's some truth to it in the sense that like red state America probably is one of the places in the entire Western world where you find the most resistance to certain aspects of the left liberal agenda, like be it anti whiteness, anti maleness, anti heteronormativity, things like that. Like, I would say on average, the average person in red state America might be more pro white, pro male, and pro heterosexual than perhaps anywhere else in the Western world. Maybe not more so than in some Eastern European countries, but quite likely more than anywhere else in the Anglosphere or Western Europe. So, like, I will give them credit for that where credit is due. Like, Red State America has deep throated the cock of liberalism and well, liberalism in the sense of like anti whiteness, anti maleness, anti heterosexuality a bit less than other parts of the Western world. And there is more resistance there. Maybe not more than in Eastern Europe, but more than in other parts of Western Europe and the Anglosphere. Except maybe Southern Italy. Southern Italy, I think, has shown some resistance. But yeah, my point is overall, though, red state America is better than many places in those regards. I won't disagree with that. Both in terms of like socially and also to some extent in terms of the laws. Like, I don't know entirely how the laws work there regarding um, things to do with feminism, like divorce or alimony or hashtag me too, like all that kind of stuff. Like, how anti male are the laws in red state America? Does it vary from state to state? I don't know. But nonetheless, in terms of like the social conditions on the ground there, I will say yes, there's more resistance there than in a lot of places. So I will give them credit where credit is due for that. However, as I've said many times, there are many other aspects of the red state American ideology that I strongly disagree with, like their obsession with individualism, with the idea of putting the individual ahead of the collective, with the idea that free market capitalism is paramount, that big mega corporations should be exalted and that we should worship them and constantly favor them over smaller corporations, small businesses. Like, um, there's that, and just the lack of respect for workers' rights, the complete and utter disregard for the natural environment, the distaste for walkable cities and traditional urbanism and for public transit. A lot of these things, and frankly, the obsession with guns, which borders on the pathological. All these things about red state America, I'm not the hugest fan of, but some of these come down to personal preference, I will admit. Um, but I think there's a lot of objective statistics you can look at to do with red state America that show that this region has a lot of serious problems. Now, I already did a video recently covering crime rate comparing blue state America and red state America. So I'm not going to get into crime rate here. I'm not going to get into crime. I'm going to cover other things here. And I also want to preface this by saying the big cope that a lot of people use is that the problems in red state America are almost entirely from the deep south states, and it's because of their high black population. In some cases, this is true, but in other cases, it's not. Like, for instance, West Virginia, which has a very low black population by US standards, is one of the worst states for many of these issues. Furthermore, regarding the non-southern, like, I don't know, West Virginia, like, some people consider it part of the South, some don't. Like, there's a lot of gray area states concerning what is southern and what is not. But even when looking at the states that are objectively not southern, like, say, Indiana, even Indiana, though, parts of southern Indiana people say are kind of southern. But yeah, even when looking at the Midwest or like states like Wyoming, for instance, some of these problems are actually as bad in these states as in the South, and in some cases worse. So I'm going to break down these problems one by one and talk about why red states are worse on average and where they are worst. So the first is, okay, a word that YouTube apparently likes to censor a lot, so I'm not going to say the word. It is the act of self-termination. The squad that Harley Quinn is a part of. So I'm just going to use the word Harley Quinn as a euphemism for it. So yes, the states that have the highest Harley Quinn rates overall are indeed red states. There seems to be a very strong correlation. However, when I looked into it further, it seems that in this case, the ones at the top of the list overwhelmingly are states in the inland west of the United States. And that includes blue states there like Colorado. It has a high Harley Quinn rate also, as does Oregon, Washington, and New Mexico. And then I realized, what do all these states have in common? High altitude. And I looked it up, and apparently there actually is a link there, and it's been verified by scientific studies that places with high altitudes have much higher rates of Harley Quinning. And not only that, but there may actually be a link with certain types of homicide also, like specifically like mass shootings and the type of mental health issues that result in both Harley Quinning and mass shootings. Because, okay, if you look at Denver, for instance, Denver is an epicenter of mass shootings. Like Columbine happened there. The Aurora movie theater massacre happened there. Side note, I actually went to that theater earlier this year. I saw Furiosa there. Yeah, random aside. There was a lot of security at that theater. And thirdly, there have been a few others. Like there was one at like a grocery store, I think, or there's been like 3 or 4 big mass shootings in the Denver metropolitan area. So yeah, I mean, there's something about altitude, high altitude, that fucks with people's brains. And from what I've seen, apparently the reason like certain people don't suffer from these problems as much, like people who have adapted to it for thousands of years, like in places like Nepal, Tibet, and Bolivia, which again, it opens a very uncomfortable can of worms for liberals. It's like, so you're saying race realism is a thing. You're saying that like genetic biological adaptation is a thing. So it's like, yeah, that opens a rabbit hole that they don't want to go down. But yeah, those places don't have these problems as much. But the fact is, you know, white people in these inland west mountain states, or like anyone who's not Native American, they just haven't lived in that kind of high altitude environment as long, and thus haven't adapted to it as much. Although it would be interesting to see if somebody like whose entire ancestry was from like the mountainous parts of Switzerland or Austria came to live there, would those people have less of those problems? Maybe. I don't know. That would be very interesting to see. I know some of my ancestors are from Austria, but I don't know how high elevation those... I could look it up, but it's beside the point. I mean, it's like a quarter of my ancestry anyway, so yeah. But yeah, my point is there is a reason for that goes outside of the red state, blue state dichotomy. However, when looking at the Harley Quinning per capita rate, it was still worse in the other red states compared to some of the blue states. Like the southern states tend to be in the middle of the list, whereas the northeast states, like in New England, New York, New Jersey, tend to be at the very bottom of the list. And again, the entire eastern half of the United States is pretty low altitude. The only state where the average area is a bit higher altitude is West Virginia. And I think they were a bit above average, a bit higher for the Harley Quinning rate. So that would correspond also. But yeah, in this case, what I'm trying to say is there's a correlation, but not necessarily a causation, although there may be a little bit of causation because it seems like the ones at the very bottom of the list are blue states, like northeast blue states, overwhelmingly. So yeah, but again, it's another reason because when a lot of people say, oh, just move to a red state, that's another factor to take into consideration is like the altitude of many of these states and how it might fuck with your brain. And again, like I've spent a lot of time traveling in these states and I didn't feel like depressed when I was there. I actually felt better because it's like, hey, I'm hiking in all these beautiful national parks. But at the same time, I will concede that like maybe being there for only a few weeks doesn't have those kinds of mental effects, whereas being there for a prolonged period of time might. So yeah, that's the first thing. The second is life expectancy. So yeah, overall life expectancy tends to be worse in red states on average. And the worst ones tend to be in the South. Not just the deep South, but also ones like Kentucky and West Virginia. So again, like there's correlations with a lot of things here, but I think like when looking at like the states with the highest life expectancies, a lot of them do tend to be like New England, New York, New Jersey, like those types of states. So again, the blue states in the Northeast. The blue states in the Northeast tend to have the best scores for a lot of metrics, frankly, especially New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. Like I would say those are overall the safest states to live in. Like if you want to live a long life and a safe life, those seem to be the best states to live in. But yeah, life expectancy is another one. GDP per capita, that's also another one. Now again, I think that's an issue where a lot of the elite and the upper middle class tend to be liberal because you have to be liberal or at least present yourself as liberal to be accepted in these kinds of jobs. And I think these kinds of careers. And I think that that's part of the reason, frankly. A lot of it is just ass kissing, status signaling, virtue signaling, and people trying to succeed in the white collar working world by being a proper liberal like you're supposed to be. So, I mean, I think that's a big part of the reason why there's a correlation between GDP per capita and blue states. But it's also, frankly, that blue states do tend to have the biggest cities and the places that are the locuses of economic activity and also academia. The only places in red states that really are like that are maybe Dallas and Houston to some extent. Like a lot, and I guess maybe Atlanta, I don't know. But I mean, a lot of the big cities that are the economic engines of the United States do tend to be in blue states. So naturally, these places do have a higher GDP per capita. And yes, the most dirt poor parts of the US do tend to be in the South, like the deep South, but also like West Virginia and Kentucky. Idaho is fairly low for GDP per capita. Also, the inland West states really vary because I think like North Dakota is really high for GDP per capita. I think it has to do with like resources. Like I think it's a big place for fracking, natural gas, stuff like that. But nonetheless, overall, blue states are higher for GDP per capita. Now, the next metric on the list is obesity. And this one is so strong that it can't just be a correlation. It has to be a causation to some effect. Now, I don't know how much food laws in the United States are determined at a state level or at a national level, but the correlation between red states and obesity is so strong that I have to ask myself, do red states just have more lenient laws in general about what you can put in food? Because that's how it seems to be. Like, it seems to be that just that's where the fat people are, red states. Now, obviously, another big part of this is the fact that red states are just so car dependent and there's so few people who walk or take public transit as part of their daily routine. Whereas in blue states, you have a not a majority necessarily, but a higher percentage, especially in cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Seattle, Portland. Like, you have way more people, like Honolulu also, people who are living those kinds of lifestyles that involve a lot of walking and a lot of taking transit. Whereas red staters tend to be very car dependent. Like, there aren't too many walkable large cities or even smaller cities in red states. Like, the only ones I can think of are New Orleans, Savannah, Charleston, and maybe certain neighborhoods of Miami. But overall, like, and I guess like there might be small walkable areas of some of the larger red state cities like Atlanta, Dallas, or even, I don't think Houston, but maybe Dallas or Atlanta or Austin, Texas, perhaps. But still, like, nonetheless, like, it's not even close. Like, the number of people in blue states who either walk, take transit, or use a bicycle as like their main means of getting around is way higher than in red states. Like, it is not even close. So I think that's a huge contributing factor to why red states have higher obesity rates. It's also the fact that I think the highest obesity rates are in the South specifically. And I just think in the South, there's like this culture of eating extremely rich food. And again, like, I think Southern cuisine is delicious. I think it should be preserved as a cultural type of cuisine, but you shouldn't be eating that kind of food every day. Like, you don't have to eat that food every fucking day. Like, it should be something that you eat, like, once a week, once every 2 weeks, whatever, as a treat, not something that you eat every damn day. Like, you shouldn't be eating fried chicken or these like chicken sandwiches with gravy or stuff like that on a day-to-day basis. Like, this is not food you should be eating every day. And again, like, this is the thing. Like, I mean, my personal way that I do it is I tend to only eat unhealthy food when I go to restaurants. When I eat at home, I eat very healthy stuff. So yeah, like that I think is the way to go. And a lot of Southerners would hate to hear that, but it's true. Like, I'm not saying ditch the family recipe, but I'm saying maybe save it for special occasions and, don't eat that kind of food every day. So yeah, this point leads me into my next point, which is the next risk factor that is a lot higher in red states on average is car accident deaths per capita. And again, this one isn't even close. It's a very strong correlation. And like I said, it's because people in red states, they drive more, they drive further, and there's fewer of them use public transit. And I think there's also a culture of just allowing reckless driving more. Like, I've actually looked it up, and I think in red states the speed limits tend to be higher on average. Like, most of the states with the highest speed limits are red states. There's a few exceptions, like Colorado is a bit of an exception there, and I think New Mexico. And I think it's kind of a regional thing to some extent, where despite being blue states, they sort of latch onto the larger regional culture in this regard, which is more of a red state culture in terms of their attitudes towards speeding. And I even saw a bumper sticker on a fucking like pickup truck. I think it was in Nevada or somewhere that said, "Speed up, this isn't California," or something like that. Like, "Get out of my way, slowpoke, this isn't California," some shit like that. And it's like, This is why your car accident death rates are so fucking high. This attitude, like having speed limits so ridiculously high, not just on freeways, but on regular streets, and having this culture of tolerance toward bad driving, which is something I don't understand. Like, why is it that conservatives, like, they have zero tolerance toward many forms of criminal behavior, but yet they do not see bad driving as criminal. They don't see it as like antisocial to drive aggressively and dangerously. And like, no, that is antisocial behavior. That is criminal behavior. And I'm not saying, like, frankly, when I was younger, yes, I used to drive like an idiot too. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that that sort of thing, it's dangerous to yourself. It's dangerous to other people. Like, aggressive driving is literally one of the deadliest things that people do on a day-to-day basis. Maybe the deadliest. And it's like, this is my issue with these red states. Like, there is this huge culture of tolerating aggressive driving. And obviously, I'm not saying this culture doesn't exist in more liberal places also, but I think it's, in some ways, it's worst in red states. It's actually among red states, but also among blacks. And funny enough, I find it correlates a lot with like the people who like absolutely refused to wear a mask during the big event of 2020, 2021. Like the people who like wouldn't wear one ever and who got really angry about it. It seems to be a huge correlation between that and like the people who insist on their right to drive really aggressively and really fast. So it's this like individualist, like, I don't give a fuck mentality. This like, fuck you, I'll do what I want. Fuck you, I do what I want. Like, that's basically the mentality behind this shit. And like, I'm not saying that I support these like mask laws, like regarding the big event. I mean, obviously it went overboard. I actually do. I do think masks work because I've been wearing them and I haven't gotten like really sick in like 5 years. But nonetheless, I mean, yeah, in that case, forcing people to wear them may have done more bad than good because it led to all these other restrictions that just fucked over our economy and destroyed people's mental health. But nonetheless, I'm saying there is a certain mentality there, this individual. And I do think in the case of bad driving, I actually do think the restrictions are justified. Like, I think stricter regulations on things like speed limits and just bad driving in general would actually be a good thing. And we need to crack down more on that shit, but in a reasonable way. Like there is such a thing as over policing there too. I'm not gonna say there isn't, but I mean, speed limits, it's also, as Strong Towns often says, like, it's not just about the speed limit, it's about the road design. That's actually the most important thing. People drive according to how the road is designed, not according to the speed limit, and we need to design our roads more safely. So yeah, I mean, but all things considered, yes, red states have far, far worse of car accident deaths per capita than blue states. Now, I haven't been able to find the statistics for car accident injuries, but I'd imagine they'd be similar. I think I actually did find those statistics for Canada though. Oh yeah, and for Canada, a lot of these same dynamics exist. I could go over them briefly when I'm done talking about the US, but the final metric I'm looking at is tobacco, and yes, the rates of tobacco usage are much higher in red states on average, especially in the southern states. There's these usual offender states that tend to be the worst for all these metrics. It tends to be like Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Like, they form an identifiable shape on the map for like so many of these metrics and other metrics too that I've seen, like people who don't own passports and things like that. Like, there's a lot of metrics where these states just stand out. So yeah, but yeah, that's another thing. Like, people smoke more in red states, and that shit is bad for your health. Don't do it. Do not listen to what Andrew Anglin says about cigarettes. They are bad for you. Just stay away from that shit. So yeah, briefly, going over Canada. A lot of the same patterns do exist. Um, However, in Canada, one thing that throws it off a little bit is that, okay, usually, okay, our conservative states, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, tend to rank worse in these metrics compared to BC, Ontario, and Quebec, which are seen as the more urban, more liberal states. However, Atlantic Canada does throw a bit of a wrench in this in Canada because they tend to vote liberal, but yet they tend to often be worse in some of these metrics also. Like they're actually worse for obesity, for life expectancy, for car accident deaths, at least some Atlantic provinces are, for the Harley Quinning rate, for GDP per capita. So in Canada, the same dynamic sort of exists, but Atlantic Canada throws a bit of a wrench into it because they do vote liberal, but yet they have these problems often even more than the prairie provinces that vote conservative. However, Ontario, Quebec, and BC tend to have these problems the least. So yeah, in Canada, it's a bit more complicated, but it does follow these patterns for these issues also. Not for crime rates though. For crime rates, it is Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba that are the worst, not Atlantic Canada. So yeah, um, that's my look at the various risk factors that are worse in red states. And I'm not trying to tell people, don't live in a red state. Like there's pros and cons, but I'm saying take these things into account and don't have this idea that it's some sort of land of milk and honey.